Hey there, econ students and teachers. In this video, we're going to look at how taxes and subsidies in the markets for particular goods affect the government's budget. What we'll find is that one type of government intervention costs the government money, while the other type of government intervention raises money for the government. Understanding how to illustrate and explain the effects of different types of government interventions on the government itself is a very important skill for your economics class. Enjoy the video, please subscribe to my channel, and head over to econclassroom.com for more great resources for economics students and teachers. In this video, we're going to examine the different effects that government interventions in the markets for particular goods have on the government's budgets. Now, you may not know what the word budget means, but basically a budget is how much income and how much spending an individual or an organization like a country's government experiences in a period of time. So both taxes and subsidies are forms of government intervention, therefore they both affect the government's budget. The question is, what is the difference between a tax and a subsidy's effect on a government's budget? In other words, how much money it brings in and how much money the government spends. We're going to start by examining the effect of a tax on a government's budget. Let's look at our graph on the left. We've already learned that a tax is a determinant of supply in a market for a good. A per unit specific tax is going to increase the marginal cost. Recall that supply represents marginal cost. So a tax is going to increase the marginal cost, shifting the supply curve upwards by the amount of the tax. So in this market, we're going to see the supply with the tax as something like this. Let's go ahead and examine the effect the tax has on equilibrium in this market. Before the tax, we would have had an equilibrium of QE, equilibrium quantity, and an equilibrium price of PE. Following the tax, however, the price is going to increase, and the quantity is going to decrease. So we have a new equilibrium of what I'll call PT, that's the price with the tax, and QT, that's the quantity with the tax. Now, how is this going to affect the government's budget? We know the tax raises the price that consumers pay for the good. We've also already learned that the price that producers get to keep for the good actually decreases. Remember that the distance between the two supply curves represents the amount of the tax. Therefore, producers get to keep a lower price. I'm going to call this price PP. And whatever price consumers pay, so that's PT minus PP, equals the amount of the per unit tax. How does the tax affect the government's budget, though? That's what we want to know. We know that the price consumers pay goes up, and the price producers get to keep goes down. And we know that there's a specific amount collected for every unit of the goods sold, represented by the difference between the price consumers pay and the price producers keep. So to understand the effect this has on the budget, all we need to do is multiply the amount of the per unit tax by the number of units sold. And that is going to be represented by what I'm shading in yellow here. The yellow rectangle, this yellow rectangle, represents the tax revenue generated by the tax on this good. Label that in black. This is our tax revenue. So the impact that a tax on a particular good has on the budget, let's take the notes down here, is it increases revenues by the amount of the tax multiplied by the quantity consumed following the imposition of the tax. A tax on a particular good increases government's revenues and actually helps the government's budget. Let's move over to our subsidy graph and examine the effect that a per unit subsidy has on a government's budget. You'll recall from a previous lesson that a subsidy is a determinant of supply, and it's basically a tax in reverse. So whereas a tax increases the marginal cost of producers, a subsidy decreases the marginal cost of producers and shifts the supply curve down vertically by the amount of the subsidy. So I'll call this supply with subsidy. The increased supply, not surprisingly, causes the equilibrium to change. Let's go ahead and label our original equilibrium of QE units and at a price of PE. Following the subsidy, we're going to see the quantity demanded increase to QS. I call that quantity with subsidy, and the equilibrium price falls to PS. The subsidy reduces the marginal costs, increases the supply, increases the quantity demanded, and decreases the equilibrium price. But to examine the effect that the subsidy has on the budget, we need to do a little further analysis here. The vertical distance between the two supply curves, this distance right here, represents the amount of the per unit subsidy. So recall, from the tax, the price that producers get to keep is lower than the price consumers pay. It's different in a subsidy though. A per unit subsidy is basically a payment on top of what consumers pay. So this over here, PS, is the price consumers are going to pay, but the price producers are going to keep is going to add the subsidy to that price. So the price producers get to keep, I'll label this the producer price, is higher than the price consumers pay. So there's an additional cost to the government of the subsidy. Rather than raising revenue for the government, the subsidy is going to cost the government. For every unit it's subsidizing, it's going to provide an additional payment to the producers of the blue vertical area there, the distance between the two supply curves, and the quantity it's going to subsidize is the quantity demanded following the subsidy. So the total cost of the subsidy is the blue rectangle that I've shaded here. Unlike a tax, rather than generating revenue, a subsidy imposes a cost to the government, and indirectly to all taxpayers in society whose money the government is using to subsidize the producers in this market. So the cost of the subsidy is shaded in blue. The revenue of a tax is shaded in yellow. And the difference between a subsidy and a tax, of course, is that the impact on the budget of a subsidy is that it actually costs the government money rather than raising money for the government. And the cost is found by multiplying the amount of the per unit subsidy by the quantity of output that is actually being subsidized. The point of this video was to review and examine the effect that taxes and subsidies have on a government's budget. Taxes generate revenue and help increase the government's budget. Subsidies cost the government money and reduce the government's budget. The areas representing the revenues and costs of these two types of government intervention were shaded in yellow and blue in these two graphs.
Here we go. One step at a time, don't be living